It reads like the script of a great political parody. Queensland's Minister for Women rejects the definition of a woman. "I want to be very clear," said the Minister for Women. "I don't stand for these sorts of values. Our community doesn't stand for these views, and Queenslanders don't have to stand for these views." End quote. The views being that biology actually matters. Joining me to discuss this is Rachael Wong, CEO of the Women's Forum Australia. Rachael, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Rachael, is the definition of a woman being an adult human female, is that offensive? Because the Queensland Minister for Women seems to think that it is.
I mean, look, I don't think it's offensive. I don't think that ordinary people think it's offensive. And to be honest, I do think it's a little bit offensive, though, that she thinks it's offensive, being an adult human female myself. So, look, it's bizarre. As I said in my article on this issue, it's like we're living in an alternate universe. This is the Minister for Women, the literal person whose job it is to represent women, and she thinks that the definition of a woman is offensive, borderline hateful potentially.
Well, I'll tell you what, if she can't define a woman, I'm not sure how she can be the Minister for Women. That would be presumably a prerequisite for her job. But this isn't the thinking of ordinary Australians. In the real world, outside of the Canberra bubble and university wokeism, I have never met anyone, man or woman, who doesn't actually know what a woman is. How about you?
That's exactly right. And look, I mean, even a couple of weeks ago, we saw Prime Minister Anthony Albanese answer the question very clearly, very simply, when asked by Piers Morgan, what is a woman? And he just said, an adult female. He said the same thing in the lead up to the federal election as well. So, I mean, if he can get it right, and most ordinary people can get it right, I don't understand why the Minister for Women can't get it right.
We talk about toxic and aggressive political movements. Well, fringe gender activism has gone so far in Australia that women are no longer allowed to define their own biology. But of course, definitions have consequences. If women are able to accurately define their identity, would that mean that they could finally justify excluding men from their spaces? Is that what activists are actually afraid of?
Afraid of excluding men from women-only spaces? You mean the men who think they're women?
Yes, if you can define a definition, then surely you can then use that definition to protect women's rights.
That's exactly right, and that's why it's so vague. And it sort of goes to what I was going to say, actually, which is that, you know, there's this absurd inability by the minister to define a woman, and we can kind of, in a way, you can kind of laugh at it because it's so stupid, but it actually is indicative of something that's incredibly dangerous and is actually playing out in Queensland politics right now, which is that views like this are used to push laws and policies which allow anyone to change their legal sex, so men being able to change their legal sex to a woman, and then being able to self-identify into women-only spaces, services, sports, and so on. And so that's sort of the logical consequence of absurd views like this. And you're right, the activists, they want to be able to maintain this position that men can self-identify as women and be included in women-only spaces and activities. And so, of course, they can't give the real definition of a woman because that sort of backfires on all the activism that they're doing.
It's like when you go back to high school debating, you have to first agree on the terms of the debate. And at the moment, we're trying to agree on the terms of a definition of gender, and that then all the politics flows on from that definition. But there's a lot of discussion about so-called toxic masculinity. It was a big thing trending for many years in the Me Too movement, you might remember, back when women were still the topic of conversation in woke politics. Not anymore. But is there anything more toxic than men standing on podiums at sports events around the world, beating women to their prizes?
Honestly, it's actually just unbelievable. If you had told, I think, a lot of women that this would have been happening during the time when we were having Me Too. And look, there were still things happening. They just weren't as maybe obvious in the public sphere. But if we'd known that we'd be in this position now where we are literally fighting for female-only spaces, female-only sports, I think people just wouldn't have believed you given how the Me Too movement was sort of panning out. But then fast forward several years and women are literally fighting for their most basic rights of just, being able to be called a woman, being able to use their own language, being able to have those single sex services and spaces. And to some people that to some people who don't really sit down and think about what that means, maybe that could sound a bit trite. Oh, well, why do women need these spaces? But actually, the reason we have these spaces in the first place, the reason why we have single-sex prisons, the reasons we have single-sex sports and so on, is because there are key fundamental physical differences between men and women. And not only physical differences in terms of strength and speed and all of that when it comes to sport, but men, by and large, are much more likely to be the perpetrators of sexual violence, and women are much more likely to be the victims. And of course, that's not to say that every single man is going to be a sexual abuser, not at all. But what it does say is that we have these single-sex spaces for a very, very good reason. And the fact that women are now having to fight for those it's absolutely insane.
Well, your comments have gained the attention of Jordan Peterson, who had a few choice words to say to Queensland's Minister for Women. Are voices like his, which are obviously extraordinarily prominent on the global stage, are they making a difference to Australian politics, or do our ministers essentially just ignore the international ridicule that's being levelled at them?
I mean, I think to have people like Peterson speaking out on this is important to push the issue out, I guess, in a more global way, to get more people talking about the issue. But the reality is, without the Australian media actually doing their job and reporting on things like this, it's very difficult to get traction. I mean, we saw over in Scotland when Nicola Sturgeon's whole thing blew up because there was a male rapist being housed in a women's prison. She herself was trying to push self-ID laws. The media there, the journalists there, actually pushed her very hard with very good questions. And that's what helped, I think, to expose the insanity of what was going on there. But in Australia, there's very few media outlets, apart from places like the Spectator, like Sky News, but places like the ABC, SBS, those, public funded broadcasters, they're not actually reporting on these things. And if they do, they're not reporting on them in a way that's critical. If anything, they're supportive. So I think without the Australian media doing its job, it's good. It's great that people like Peterson are speaking out. And if there are more, maybe that would help put pressure on the Australian media. I'm not quite sure. And then in turn on the Australian politicians. But I think at home, there really needs to be more work done by the Australian media.
Well, just a quick comment about the role of the media when it comes to radical gender activism and also protecting the rights of women. How much of a role has the media played in harming women's rights when they refuse to use gendered language like mother and woman, or when they placate this fringe movement and refuse to acknowledge biological reality when they're talking about even perpetrators of crime? They will describe them as women when they are men. And so the logic of an article, for instance, or a news report makes no internal consistency, and yet this is being put forward as the genuine narrative. Is that harmful to women's rights, and is that making this more difficult for you?
It's absolutely harmful. It's hugely damaging. Language, as we know, is something that, helps to frame a conversation, helps to communicate the reality and the truth of a situation. And so when the media are using language effectively as a weapon against women by, either using sort of degrading, dehumanizing language like uterus owner or bleeder or so on, or actually attributing male crimes to women. And not only that, there was a piece, I think, in the BBC maybe a year or so ago where a victim of sexual abuse was talking about her rapist, and she had clearly used gendered language throughout the interview. And they had changed that language throughout the entire interview. I think they made it more sort of neutral. It was they may have even changed it to feminine language. But basically what I'm saying is that women's voices are being silenced through this, and male crimes are being attributed to women. So I think it's incredibly damaging. I think the media have a lot to answer for.
Well, just finally here, Rachel, do you think that we are starting to see the tide turn against fringe activism? Because let's not forget, for most of this story that's been going on against women, it was a fringe news article you might see in a trash mag once in a while, but now it has well and truly made its way into mainstream politics, and ordinary women are starting to come across this politics in their real lives. Is that going to cause a major backlash? And do you think that the majority of women will finally win this discussion?
I think, firstly, yes, there's definitely been a change over the last few years. I remember several years ago when we sort of first started getting into this issue at Women's Forum Australia, there wasn't as much conversation going on. fast forward a few years and there's definitely a lot more going on, even though the sort of mainstream media outlets may not be representing things in a way that I think is always honest. I think there is definitely more conversation in the public sphere. And I think a lot more women and just ordinary Australians are waking up to, I guess, the harms of gender ideology. You know, every time someone like Shannon Fentiman gives a ridiculous definition of a woman, every time a woman gets cancelled for speaking out on this, I think a few more people wake up. So I think there is a change. I think, you know, it'll be a matter of time before some of the real harms that have been caused by this ideology, it'll be some time before they can get rolled back. But I think there is definitely positive movement being made.
Well, final question. The rubber really hits the road here in Queensland with the self-ID bill, which you mentioned in your article. How important is it that this bill does not become permanent law inside Queensland as far as the rights of women go?
It's incredibly important. So, as myself and other women have been saying for a long time now, we've been sort of advocating around this issue for at least the last 6 months since the bill got introduced. This bill will allow anyone in Queensland to change their legal sex. It will allow any man to self-identify as a woman for any reason, really. And so that means that not only will people who are genuinely confused about their gender going to be able to change their legal sex, but a male for any other kind of reason, including predatory reasons, can do the same thing. And so that means that males will be able to access female-only changing rooms, sports, refuges, bathrooms, prisons, etc. And of course, it goes both ways. But as we all know, the risk is to women in the sense that men, stronger, they're the ones who are more likely to commit sexual violence and so on. So the reason for these spaces being separate is, generally speaking, to protect women. And so if these laws get passed in Queensland, it's going to really, really set women's rights back.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today at Spectator Australia TV. Where can our readers go to support you or to support your cause?
So womensforumaustralia.org is our website, and we are also on Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn. If you'd like to sign our petition against Queensland self-ID laws, you can also do that on our website.
Thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you, Alexandra.